A good way to mental health is through knowing oneself. There are two main ways that one can know thyself. There is the personal individual self that you are, the you that is you and not anyone else. This is something we will touch on in this chapter, but we'll really get into later in the book. Then there is the common, the collective self that is the same for you as it is for every other human. This second aspect of the self is what the self actually is. It is the framework, the parts of the body, the brain, and the experiences that give rise to your own personal, individual self. In fact, since the self is an artifact, an emergent property of a biological information processing system, the framework that gives rise to the human self has many aspects in common with not only all animals, but plants, and in the most general sense, all life too. The self is best described from our current perspective as the software of our information processing system. So to understand the self, we need to understand biological processing systems. All life is a system from single cells, plants, animals, and us. Every individual that makes up this category of things called life is a processing system. A processing system is a system that receives, processes, and reacts to matter and energy. A system is made up of individual parts that interact, have relationships in such a way as to create, to define the system. Everything within this universal existence is, or is part of, a system, and most things are both. Most of the systems within this universal existence, such as atoms, galaxies, and solar systems, are just regular old systems. But on this planet, at least, we find naturally occurring processing systems, and we call them life. The evolution of life on this planet is the birth and evolution of processing systems. Systems that must receive, process, and react to matter and energy in order to maintain their existence, their life. The direction of the evolution of life has and continues to be toward greater abilities to receive, process, and react to matter and energy, and recently, in relative terms, information. At the start of the evolution of life, we find individual prokaryote cells, then the more complicated eukaryote cells, which are the building blocks for all multicellular organisms. Next, in the evolution of living processing systems, we see a burst of plants, marking the start of the evolution of the body. Fun fact, what we know of as our emotional responses are the chemical communications between cells within the body as the body is deciding if we should move toward or away from the stimulus that is being received. This most basic bodily, chemical, and emotional information processing mechanism is the same for all bodies, plants and animals alike. Although we don't usually call them emotions in plants, as plants lack a brain and so do not have the capacity to feel the chemical and emotional messages within their body. The body itself is not a dedicated information processing system, which is why we don't see plants up and walking around town. To move around the world and have senses as we know them, you need a dedicated information processing system, also known as a brain. A body is a matter and energy processing system. It takes in matter and energy, such as water and sunlight in the case of plants, and processes the things it receives in order to produce the reaction of staying alive. The information processing that happens within the body is of a very general type, providing general meaning for how the body should react to receive matter and energy, meaning to move away from stimuli, what we know as pain, and meaning to move toward a stimuli, what we know as pleasure. So while plants lack the brains to get up and move around the world, the chemical message system of the body enables them basic regulation and is the underlying mechanism that will evolve to provide emotional meaning in animals. The next big leap in the evolution of life came through a type of cell called a neuron, and when these cool cats get together, amazing things happen. Neurons stand out from the other, what we could call regular cells of the body, because they form direct relationships and communicate directly with other neurons. This communication is specialized for information processing compared to the other cells within the body. Most of the cells in the body communicate generally through sending out chemical messages which float through the body until they bump into cells that happen to have the right receptor for the particular message sent. We first see loose collections of neurons in organisms such as mollusks and jellyfish. And as this early brain development started in the oceans, it makes sense that early sensory development, such as the development of eyes, also happened in the ocean. Remember that the evolution of life is the evolution of processing systems, and the direction of life's evolution has been toward greater abilities to receive, process, and react. So, running parallel with neurons and the evolution of a dedicated information processing system for the body is the evolution of better abilities to receive information, our senses such as eyes, taste, smell, and so on, and the evolution of better abilities for the body to react like limbs, fins, tentacles, and the like. The evolution of the brain has undergone a few notable stages. First, we have the basic brain, the cerebellum, which evolved as the first point of coordination between the body and the outside world. Next, we have the limbic system. This part of the brain evolved to represent the general emotional processing from within the body. The cerebellum handles the basic sensory to body response, but the body ultimately calls the shots by providing meaning, and the limbic system evolved to represent that meaning informationally. The last stage of note is the cerebrum, the top part of the brain, which is what we usually think of when thinking of a brain. The cerebrum is where sensory information is recreated so that we can witness it within mind. The cerebrum also has the latest brain technology, the prefrontal lobe that enables organisms to better see relationships between things. This ability to make connections is a key component in our power for abstraction, for abstract thought. The self is best thought of as your informational body, the body of information that you develop through experience. The function of the self is to determine meaning, and through determining meaning, the self is the cause of your information processing reactions, which are the contents of mind, emotional, sensory, and language and behavior. The self is three-dimensional, although not in the typical physical sense of having height, width, and length. The three dimensions of the self are the three types of information that make up the self: sensory, emotional, and language. As we go through life, we experience. For a system to experience something, it must be able to receive and process the thing. And whenever there is processing, there is a reaction. This is as true in a physical body sense, experiencing a cup of coffee, as it is in an information processing sense, experiencing our knowing that we are drinking a cup of coffee. We are experience machines, and our information processing system is continually receiving, processing, and reacting to things. When we receive information into our brain, sensory and emotional information, the brain processes information by creating an internal representation of that information. It is this internal representation that we witness within our mind. Now, the important part here, the contents of our mind, are a reaction of our brain's processing, but they also function as an input back into our brain's processing to be processed along with the next information received into the brain, generating the next set of contents in our mind. What this creates is a feedback loop and an aspect of our experience, the experience of the contents of our mind, that is as real to our information processing system as our experience with the external sensory world or our internal emotional world. So when we say that experience shapes our self, it is both our external experience and our experience within mind that shapes our self. Humans often develop such a focus on the contents of mind, especially our thoughts, that this internal experience can be more influential in shaping our self than our external experiences. This can be a negative thing when we need to be in tune with reality, but can be advantageous when thrust into negative experiences within the world. We shall talk more about this feedback loop later in the book when discussing practical applications of this perspective. But it is this mechanism that we can exploit for our own self-programming goals. As we experience, our brain is relating things together, taking bits of information and creating greater concepts from them. The most basic information processing relationships animals develop are sensory and emotional ties. Remember that the emotional responses within the body are the most basic way for a system to generate meaning. And we need to generate meaning to make decisions on whether to move toward or away from things. So, the point of developing sensory and emotional ties is so we can associate emotional meaning with the sensory information we receive. This ties our own emotional meaning to the things of the world. And we designate the things of the sensory world as repulsive, things to be moved away from, or attractive things to move toward. There is an analogy which you will become very familiar with by the end of this book. It comes from the Bhagavad Gita, an ancient book of knowledge from what is now modern-day India, and it is called the analogy of the chariot. The analogy is a way for us to imagine how the various parts of our body and brain information processing system come together, how the parts relate, for us to produce reactions, the sensory, emotional, language contents of mind and behavior. So, imagine the parts involved with operating a chariot. We have the chariot itself. The chariot is pulled along by horses. The horses have reins attached to them. And on the chariot stands a charioteer who holds the reins to direct the horses. In this analogy, the chariot is our body, and our body is pulled along by our emotional responses, which the horses represent. Remember that what we know as our emotional responses are the chemical communication between cells within the body. In order for you to move your body to do anything at all, the cells within the body need to be coordinated, so they need to communicate. You are literally unable to move your body without cellular communication, without emotional responses. And it's not that some people don't have emotional responses, it's just that we can develop to be ignorant of what is actually going on within our body. So, our emotions are our horses. They are the drive, the force that pulls the body, the chariot around. It should come as no surprise to you that we need to keep our emotions in check. We do so with a charioteer holding onto reins to direct the horses, keeping them on the right path and preventing them from running off the path and smashing up the chariot. In this analogy, the charioteer is wisdom and the reins are the mind. So this means that we need to use wisdom to hold on to the mind and to use the mind to direct the horses, keeping them on the right path for us. Without wisdom holding onto the reins, holding onto your mind, what happens? Well, without wisdom, what happens is that the reins, your mind, are pulled along by the horses by your developed emotional responses. These responses are developed through the sensory and language relationships, the stories you have built around particular emotional responses through experience. This is something you can recognize when practicing techniques such as mindfulness, where you take note of the thoughts that you find running through your mind, especially if you struggle with uncontrolled or pervasive thoughts. A process for this could include first, recognizing the types of common thoughts you have, then assessing the content of the thoughts, the nature of the stories. If not immediately apparent, you could look deeper and see the emotional drive that is actually behind the thoughts. As a note of encouragement, if you find yourself in a situation of pervasive or uncontrolled thoughts, please know that they can be overcome through spending time developing wisdom, training your charioteer to take its rightful place of control in this situation. We will spend more time later in the book going over practical ideas, tips and techniques, and things such as mindfulness. For now, we will finish formulating the perspective from which our practical work will be based. Human beings are supposed to develop self-sovereignty. Sovereignty is supreme power or authority, so each individual human is supposed to develop supreme power or authority over their own self. This is the way. The way that humans do this is through experience. Experience shapes our self, as everything we experience, for bad or good, becomes a part of us. The role of a parent or caregiver is to provide good experiences for the child and limit bad experiences, with the overall goal that the child will develop self-sovereignty. It is said that it takes a village or society to raise a child, so the same can be said in the social sphere. It is the role of those humans or institutions that have the power to shape or define social experiences, to ensure that developing young individuals within society have easy access to the types of experiences that are good at developing self-sovereignty, and limited access to the types of experiences that are not good for the development of self-sovereignty. In reference to the analogy of the chariot, self-sovereignty is a state in which wisdom has been sufficiently developed to drive the system. This doesn't necessarily mean that wisdom is in active control all the time. Rather, it means that wisdom has been developed to allow the horses to explore if it is appropriate, but retains the ability to bring the horses back onto the right path if they start pulling the body somewhere that will lead to harm, physical or mental, of self or others. You want to develop enough control, enough will, so that you can let go and follow your emotional drives, but retain the strength and foresight to pull back on the reins when your emotional drives are going to cause harm to self or others. So how do we develop this wisdom, this will, so that we would be in control of our information processing system? Well, the key is found within our conceptual development, the evolution of self beyond our sensory and emotional ties, to add language, a third dimension, to the sensory and emotional packets of related information. And then we go further with language and our ability to make connections to full-on abstraction rooted in reality, a measured good. Before we leave our mother's womb, we are already making sensory and emotional connections, while in the womb, we are connected to our mother's emotional system. Her emotional responses to the sights and sounds we hear shape our initial emotional and sensory relationships. Once born, and as our senses fully come online, we quickly organize the sensory world in terms of our emotional, pleasure and pain responses. In doing so, we are identifying individual things of the world by their sensory data, the sight, smell, sound, touch and taste of things. This is why babies want to touch and taste everything. They are building up a sensory information profile about the individual things they encounter, and they are assigning an emotional meaning to the packets of sensory information they receive. Are they repulsive, causing pain and unpleasant feelings, making us want to move away from them? Or are they attractive, causing pleasure and pleasant feelings, making us want to move toward them? Onto these developing sensory and emotional packets of information, we quickly start adding the third dimension, language. You all have a fair idea of how this progresses. We start with names, ball, cat, car, and so on, associating the sound of the name with the sensory and emotional packet we have already developed. Language is critical for abstraction because language is an abstraction in itself. The name of something, say the word cat, is an abstraction of the cats in the real world that we come to know through our senses. Not only can language represent sensory objects, but it can also represent emotional objects. Just as we first start learning the names of sensory objects, we also start learning the names of emotional objects, such as pain, pleasure, hungry, full, tired, awake, and so on. While our introduction to language begins with names, we quickly learn that with language, we can describe relationships between things. This is where our power for abstraction starts to take off. Our brain, our information processing system, works by making connections between things. As we learn language, we start organizing our sensory and emotional world by way of stories. And so it is, as we get older, the substance of our self develops as a web of stories, a map of relationships. Abstraction is a double-edged sword for our species. On the one hand, abstraction is a powerful tool for seeing deeper into the reality that is beyond our immediate senses, such as gravity or the laws of thermodynamics. But on the other hand, our ability for abstraction, if we do not take the time or effort to ensure a grounding in reality, can spiral into fantasy. Unfortunately, our species is suffering from the second situation when it comes to our social governance and organization. We have neglected to ensure that our social abstractions are grounded in reality, and we have an increasing mental illness problem that is caused by humans being born and operating within a system that has long lost touch with what is good. But let's not think too much about our social problems just now. There will be time for that later. We need to sort our own individual issues out first before we address society. The development of self-sovereignty is the development of a conceptual, language-abstracted perspective of existence that does, indeed, faithfully represent reality. The whole point of our information processing system is to make decisions for our movements within reality, and to do this we need good, accurate information about reality. If the ideas, beliefs and stories that we develop are more fantasy than reality. How are we supposed to make good decisions in reality? We can't. As a child, we start developing our sensory, emotional, and language conceptual framework, also known as the self. Before we can develop actual wisdom, our conscious or conceptual will, the root cause for our reactions, the contents of mind and behavior, is our bodily emotional responses. It's a state where the horses are driving the system, where cognitive or relationship and language processing of the brain is slave to emotions. The ego is a stage that all humans go through, but must be viewed as such, a stage in our cognitive development, something to be worked through, to evolve or develop out from. To progress beyond the base ego to what could be described as a super-ego, the individual needs experiences to evolve, where the cause for their reactions, the contents of mind and behavior comes from. This is a process of evolving will from one's infantile and base emotional drives to find the cause of our reactions stemming from our developed higher emotional and conceptual drives. This is a process of evolving your processing system so that instead of reactions being driven by base emotional responses, such as the pursuit of immediate pleasure, gratification, to a state where the contents of your mind and behaviors are more driven by higher emotional and conceptual drives, like love, benevolence, compassion, understanding, empathy, and creativity. Another way of describing this personal evolution from a child that needs to be governed by the authority of others to a mature human being with self-sovereignty is through the evolution of the concept of self. At the ego side of the spectrum, where the direction of the chariot is determined by the horses, the individual considers the self to be their own personal physical body. As the individual grows conceptually and cognitively, so too does their concept of self. We start to consider others, such as our immediate family or close friends, as being essentially the same as our own personal self. We would consider the impact of our behavior on them as much as we would consider the impact of our behavior on our own personal self. We choose a partner to spend our life with, to raise a family with, and we extend our concept of self to them and our children. With more enlightenment and more conceptual development, we start to extend the concept of self to include members of our immediate community. And there is no reason why we cannot extend this concept of self further to include all of humanity, or even all of life. In this idea, we find that being selfish is not necessarily a bad thing. It all depends on how far we are able to extend our concept of self. Acting selfish when you consider the self to be your own personal body can be thought of as bad. Yes, although acting selfish when you are including all life in your concept of self can be thought of as a good thing. It's all a matter of perspective. This personal evolution we speak of, from child to self-sovereign, from ego to superego, from a chariot at the mercy of the horses to a chariot in the charge of wisdom, is the path to mental health. It is the way. We are a product of our experiences, so if we want to cultivate and maintain mental health, we need to fill our life with experiences that are good for cultivating and maintaining mental health. While our conceptual and information processing development is generally assisted through learning about the world, its things, and the laws that govern relationships, nothing is as good for mental health as language development. We shall talk about this idea later, but the general gist is that if you want to program a computer, then you use a computer language, and if you want to program a human, you use a human language. As an information processing system, our software, the self, is a complex web of stories with sensory, emotional, and language dimensions, and at the core of our information processing, whether we explicitly recognize it or not, is the concept of good. At the end of the day, all humans want to do what is good for the self. Even humans who do evil and despicable things want to do and be good. It's just that their idea of what is good, their measure of quality, is distorted from how other humans would measure quality. When we talk of mental health, we need to specifically define what is good. This is because while the mental aspect refers to our information processing system, our decision-making, that which produces our reactions, the contents of mind and behavior, the health aspect is a measure of quality, and quality is measured in terms of bad and good. From this perspective, mental health is therefore simply found within an information processing system that is producing good reactions, good sensory, emotional, and language contents of mind, and good behaviors. While mental illness is found within an information processing system that is producing bad reactions, bad sensory, emotional, and language contents of mind, and bad behaviors. Now we are at a point in our exploration of the way to mental health that rests on the definition of the word good. So we shall end this chapter here, pause, reflect, and we will meet back for the next chapter to explore the quality crisis and the science delusion, why you want to be a philosopher.